Oh, oh, thank you. Someone did that for me. Did the co-host do that? Oh gosh, thank you so much. It's so great to have a co-host. I was just remembering, actually, I think. So I wanted to begin by thank you. This is the third session on mid-20th century poetry. This one goes to the end of the century as well. It's the first of the three that isn't centered some way or another around Robert Lowell and his legacy, his complicated legacy. So I think we're stepping into something new. The previous sessions, I think, had a lot to do with Lowell's legacy, but also with the spectrum of psychological and personal and political, gendered, spiritual otherness, self and other, maybe together. I think that may continue here and maybe adding ethnicity in a way. I guess there was some Kendrick Lamar, there was that, but I think maybe we'll go back to that topic. I'm going to introduce all four of our speakers. I hope they're all here. I think I see most of you. I see Bill, Wei. Yeah, I see all the Wei and Lisette. So I'm going to introduce the four of you, and then we can go in the order that you're listed on the program. First to speak will be Lisette Ordorica Lassiter, who's the daughter of Mexican immigrants. She's assistant professor of English at Palomar College in California. Her research interests include Chicano Latino literature and cultural studies, Chicana feminism, and American literature, theater, and performance. She has an article on Sherry Moraga and Lorna de Cervantes forthcoming in the Bloomsbury Handbook of Contemporary American Poetry, edited by Craig Svanken and myself. Next up is William Bill Moore, who is professor of English at California State University, Long Beach. His important study, which I recommend, is called Holdouts, the American Poetry Renaissance, 1948 to 1992. It was published by University of Iowa Press in 2011. His essays have appeared in such journals as William Carlos Williams Review, Journal of Beat Studies, and the LA Review of Books. He has another forthcoming article in the Bloomsbury Handbook of Contemporary American Poetry. His collection of poems, The Headwaters of Nirvana, is a bilingual edition published by What Books in 2018. And he also blogs at Bill Moore Poet, one word, lowercase.com. Our third speaker is Wei Liu, who is a PhD candidate in English at the University of Virginia. His interests include global modernism, transnational and post-colonial studies, world literature, and poetry and poetics. Wei is working on a dissertation entitled Provincial Matters, Poetry, Space, and Approaches to Global Cultural Politics, 1936 to 2004. And finally, William Bill Fogerty is assistant professor of English at the University of Central Florida. His current book project, Local Tongues, The Politics of Speech in Poetry, argues that local speech constitutes a transnational poetic resource for bridging aesthetic and socio-political realms. He's recently published essays in 20th century literature and the Journal of Working Class Studies, and he has work forthcoming in The Comparatist. So welcome all, good to have you here. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn over the floor to Lisette Lassiter, who's going to speak on Lorna de Cervantes and the poetics of Chicana daughterhood. Lisette.
Great, thank you, Steve. So what I'll be presenting today is excerpted from the chapter that Steve spoke of. And in the longer chapter, I talk a little bit about anxiety of influence and slaying the literary father, but I must say, Steve, thank you for your editorial hands. There's no slaying there. There's no anxiety there. As anyone who's worked with Steve knows, he's just an incredible collaborator. So thank you for that opportunity. All right, so let me just get my pages set up here. And I'm going to start a little timer for myself. All right. So I am the American-born daughter of a Mexican-born mother. And she often says, ser madre es sufrir, or to be a mother is to suffer. And like many young women, I felt a profound disconnect from my mother, starting from early adolescence and into young adulthood. I wanted to be more American than Mexican. As a Mexican daughter, my life appeared to be delineated by gender duties and obligations, and the suffering my mother speaks of appeared to be an inevitable fate. Between my broken Spanish, or what Lorna de Cervantes calls my excuse me tongue, and her limited English, growing up and still today, I often struggle to understand my mother, literally and figuratively. The gap between us is one of both language and worldviews. So the question that drives me personally and drives my work is, if to be a mother is to suffer, what is it to be a daughter? And I find some of the answers I seek in the writing of other daughters. My reading of Daughters Who Write is informed by existing feminist literary scholarship of intersectionality, to which it adds the social and gendered identity of daughter. Through creative and critical works, Chicana, Latina, Latinx daughters can stage public conversations about traumas experienced by women, personally and historically. Writers and their readers can thus serve as what Tiffany Ana Lopez calls critical witnesses, enabling both to act as agents for social change. Critical witnessing, or engaged critical reading of texts, further allows for understanding, the very foundation for personal and social change. The practice of critical witnessing is tied to testimonio, or life writing. The examination and sharing of the personal creates a space for questioning cultural norms and allows for connection with others who may have had the same experiences, thus making our own legible. Through the critical witnessing that writing and reading the work invites, Chicanas and Latinas can recognize their mothers as fully human, as women outside of the social construct of motherhood, with hopes and dreams of their own that they may have never had a chance to pursue. As a reader, as a scholar, as a daughter, poetry has saved my life. And I adopt that phrasing from Cervantes herself in an interview with Sonia Gonzalez. We know and experience the world through our bodies. And I believe poetics, more than any other genre, best at least attempts to articulate what it feels like to live in a world and bodies conscribed by gender, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, and as subject positions that have historically struggled for agency and voice. Cervantes scholar Eliza Rodriguez E. Gibson argues that Cervantes's work situates poetry as a theoretical site and places the voice of a working class Chicana feminist at the center of our discourse. Much of Cervantes's work examines herself through and against her mother. And when we listen to that voice, we also hear how it is informed by traumatic maternal loss. Cervantes was 28 when her mother, Rose, was violated and murdered in her home, which was then set on fire by the attackers. In Cervantes, I examine a kind of double absence, that of a mother who is first somewhat emotionally unavailable, then physically unavailable due to her death, but who remains key to the daughter's development of voice. How does the economy of language, use of imagery, metaphor, and structure that the genre of poetry invites allow for a daughter to tell both her own and her mother's story, particularly in a mother's absence? In Cervantes, absence is as important as presence. And poetry is a powerful means of understanding how subjectivity can come from loss as well as presence. Cervantes's work is actually imbued with loss prior to her mother's death. The loss of innocence through sexual violence in lots 1 and 2, the loss of her Mexican culture and language in Refugee Ship, the loss of her city streets in Freeway 280, and the loss and recovery of her Chumash heritage in Poem to Los California Muertos and For My Ancestors Adobe'd in the Walls of the Santa Barbara Mission. These losses situate the mother-daughter relationship at the heart of a legacy of colonialism, social dysfunction, and institutional violence. Cervantes adds to and complicates existing female poet narratives about mothers, particularly through the theme of traumatic loss within a Chicana cultural context, or what Rodriguez y Gibson calls a poetics of loss that transfigures meanings of historically devastating experiences. If the daughter, through her writing, is a critical witness for her mother, poetry invites us to witness for the daughter. Jeanette Calhoun-Mish identifies Cervantes' work as a form of storytelling, a contemporary poetic practice, lyric narrative, a hybrid poetic, and witness poems. She continues, the hybrid lyric narrative form is commensurate with the twin goals of poetry as witness and poetry as art. Cervantes describes her work as docu-poetry, documenting my personal history as a participant in the women's movement, holding the absolute belief that the personal is political and it is absolutely personal when it comes to women's bodies. Cervantes is part of a legacy of Chicana Latina daughters who write, including Adelina Anthony, Sherry Moraga, Dulce Maria Solis, and Sandra Cisneros, among many others who delve into their mother's histories as a mean of exploring new territory in mother-daughter relationships. When a mother is physically gone, this exploration becomes even more fraught. Cervantes spends a lifetime asking questions in her mother's absence. In her 2008 work, A Chicana Codex, Sherry Moraga writes that the elder Chicanas, including her mother, are her codex, a reference to Mayan historical manuscripts that are a history told and foretold. Losing one's mother then leaves the daughter without a map. The daughter must now draw it herself. When Cervantes seeks a map, she finds ash, smoke. Cervantes' poetry and the major poem that I'll discuss today, Striking Ash from 2006's Drive, is a record of a daughter navigating a world shaped by loss. Drive is dedicated to her mother and opens with a closing line from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, the fire and the rose are one. Cervantes uses quotations from four quartets to start each of the books within Drive, a fitting thematic tribute or parallel to Eliot's musings on time, as Drive illustrates how a journey through the past can be an attempt to understand who we are in the present. Fire is a visceral reminder of the violence of her mother's death. Fire and rose, beauty and destruction. The two are always tied up together for Cervantes. Eliot asks in Four Quartets, but to what purpose, disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves? I do not know. For Cervantes, disturbing the dust may be an attempt to find something new in the familiar place of grief. But I also want to consider what is at stake in remembering and the role of memory in healing. Survivors of trauma may not always remember by choice. Gonzalez notes how Cervantes writes about the past as a carnivorous animal in relentless pursuit of its prey, and of how traumatic memories emerge time after time until the survivor can consciously grasp the original event. In the act of writing, the poetic persona can stay present with the past. And by staying present with the past, Cervantes creates an opportunity for us to critically witness for her and her mother. We cannot afford to forget Rose's violent death. Her life is worth remembering, as it reminds us how women everywhere still struggle with the same issues of poverty and violence, and love lack. In Striking Ash, Cervantes addresses her mother and tells the reader a story that shifts between her experience as a grieving daughter and her mother's life. In this poem, the mother has been gone longer than she was alive for her daughter. Cervantes mourns not just the loss of her mother, but also the limited opportunities of her mother's life. The daughter lives in grief and mourning, but is able to strike ash and dust off her memories in an attempt to reveal or discover who her mother was. The poem opens with imageries of distress. The textual daughter is not at rest. She writes, "If I sleep at all." Sleep is not a respite, for when she dreams, it is not a means of escape, but a space where her mother's absence once again becomes present. If she does dream at all, she dreams of the excess of lack. She writes, "The utter silence of you gone gushes out." She juxtaposes silence and absence with gush. There's a sudden overflow of absence, of quiet. And in her dreams, the sentries who guard the past ignite these mute birds into flutterings of love. This passage revives the trope of birds in Cervantes' work. Being emplumada, or which is a play on words on being emplumed, as in feathered, but also refers to the Mexican or the Spanish word for pen, pluma, being emplumada empowers her through language. Yet the past is guarded. Access isn't a given. A sentry is a guard who denies access to those who aren't authorized. Who is allowed to remember? By remembering, Cervantes can turn overwhelming silence, figured here as mute birds, into something productive, the flutterings of love being the tender memories of her mother. Birds in the poetics of Lorna de Cervantes sing their heart out, caw warnings, call out thieves, flutter in her heart. In this poem, they are mute. We only hear them through their motions. Cervantes then muses, how is it that death is so inconspicuously blunt, bludgeon? These lines introduce images of unexpected violence and weight that leave behind fragments. While others may have time to grapple with their mother's aging and death, Cervantes only has pieces she must weave together, a photo, a report, soot. The poem's abrupt line breaks mimic the disjointed feeling in the aftermath of trauma, and its lack of punctuation throughout mimics the way traumatic memories may flow relentlessly. Her mother did not go gently, but instead, Cervantes writes, a mean luck wrenched you from my hands. Death is inevitable, yet the means of death aren't. Violent death leaves survivors with a different set of questions they may revisit over and over in an attempt to make sense of what happened. The survivors of the dead must then live in a world where the unthinkable can happen. Cervantes mourns the life her mother was never able to lead, not in terms of future potential, but in terms of the limited life she was born into and trapped in. Cervantes circles the remains of their home, where we lived listless as shells. Her body mirrors the house. It is slack, while the house's frame is spent. Both have succumbed to the forces of grief and loss. She addresses her mother directly, as you, mother, dreamed of somebody you could be. Notably, this is the first time she has addressed her mother directly in a poem since before Rose's death. While Rodriguez E. Gibson notes how the apostrophe in general creates a deferral of meaning, and it's a means of connection with the reader, Cervantes' shift from you to you, mother, grounds the poem in her personal loss. And although she has escaped the fate of the house that would contain her, the daughter is still linked to the mother. You are gone, and still you are dragging me with you. She is a sleepless child, helpless before the toe, past colored treats, past dolls' heads, past dripping wrecks. Her mother takes her on a strange subterranean journey, but the daughter then gives her permission to usher me anywhere, mother. The movement imagery of drag, tow, and usher illustrate two poles of connection with the mother. To be dragged is to be unwilling, but to be ushered is to be escorted or directed in a mutual understanding of movement. Either way, Cervantes appears helpless against the force that moves her. She's not the one driving. Her mother is the one who leads. And Cervantes' willingness to be led at this moment is a reminder of the often tempting pull of grief and memory. For survivors of trauma, grief can be a familiar place, something you knowingly dive or slide into. If Cervantes is at the wheel of our reading experience, where does she drive our attention? I return to critical witnessing's goal of generating a level of emotional response that leads to personal and social change. Cervantes suggests we return again and again to where the dead would pull us. I learn why we come here, striking ash off what we've loved. Ash gets into the cracks, into your mouth and ears and hair and lungs, and threatens to choke you. And once it settles, it obscures what it lands upon. If left long enough, it solidifies and takes on the shape of what it covers, like the tortured bodies of Pompeii. Ash solidifies into a mold that must be broken to reveal treasure beneath. Her mother may exist beneath the ash, and the writing of memory is a way to recognize the substance of her absence. Ash merely obfuscates her, much like the adobe walls of the Santa Barbara mission that hold her ancestors' bones. Yet, as the poem concludes, Cervantes can never really find her mother, only evidence of her. Her presence is an imagery of fire and ash, but it isn't the renewing cycle of a phoenix. Instead, ash is a stain that demands she remember, like the marks on a forehead on Ash Wednesday. Ash here is a private mark that symbolizes her grief. In 4 quartets, Eliot writes, We shall not cease from exploration. What does the Chicana Latina daughter poet learn from her exploration? And what do we learn about what it is to be a daughter from witnessing? Poetry remains a way for us to both give shape to and reshape the pain of the distance between us and our mothers, metaphorical or otherwise. The poetics also are a means to find beauty in wounds that open again and again. Thank you. Oh, you're muted, Steve.
Thank you. I don't know why I'm malfunctioning now. Thank goodness for Lisette who is helping me out. I wanted to say really wonderful talk, Lisette. And now Bill Moore will speak to us about Bruce Boyd, poet perdu of the West Coast Poetry Renaissance. Bill.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Lizette, for a very interesting talk. I look forward to the conversation afterwards. First of all, I'll preface this with two things. One is that when I teach, I use share screen all the time and I'm never nervous about it. And this is the first time I've felt nervous about hitting share screen. I have no idea of what will happen. That's what it feels like. I'll also preface this by saying that mid-century poetry was characterized by Robert Lowell in 1960 as the raw and the cooked. And this is about a poet on the raw side. So we have, in a sense, a very comprehensive panel here, and that's it. Bruce Boyd, poet, Purdue, the West Coast Poetry Canon, or in a new subtitle, Why We Need a Canon of Minor Poets More Than Ever. So let me hit shared screen and see if I can have any luck whatsoever. And here is indeed, at least you can see the cover of the opening text that I'll be referring to.
Yes.
So midway through Stephen Billetto's The Beats, a literary history, we get a reminder of the usual path to literary canonization. In the first sentence of chapter 8, Billetto summarizes the goal of the previous chapter's focus on literary magazines such as Eugen, Beatitude, and The Floating Bear as, quote, sketching a messy though identifiable beat sensibility and aesthetic. He goes on to say that chapter 8 will concentrate on, quote, the widening of the beat movement by looking at books by those whose writing had initially appeared in little magazines. Very familiar, right? From
Bill, it's no longer sharing screen. I don't know whether it's supposed to be.
I think I thought I turned it off.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, you did.
Yes,
Just wanted to make sure.
I turned it off. Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah.
Sorry.
Not a problem. Not everybody who appeared in all three of those magazines, however, made the transition from magazines to book publication, even when their work was included in the pivotal anthology edited by Donald Allen, The New American Poetry. Of all the poets in that book, one and only one has the peculiar distinction of never having had a chapbook of their poems published, let alone a full-length edition. While I am hoping to change that textual aporia within the next year or so, I would like to consider Boyd's poetry today as an indication of what might prove to be a necessity if we were ever to understand how to deal with the surplus of poetry that has been written in the United States since this nation triumphed in World War II. First, though, who was this obscure beat poet, and how is it that his writing has had to work so assiduously to remain on the faint periphery of special collections libraries? It's not, after all, as if his work was unknown to other poets. He corresponded with both Jack Spicer and Gary Snyder, sat zazen with Joanne Kiger, and had his work praised by fellow Venice West poet Stuart Z. Perkoff, also a contributor to New American Poetry, and a letter to Donald Allen in 1958 that clearly defined the important contribution Boyd had made in that community's formation and development. Nor was Boyd a hermetic poet, content to be reticent within print culture as to his authorial image. In the year before Allen's anthology came out, Boyd took part in a public reading to benefit Our Hound Press in San Francisco that included 8 other poets who appeared in Allen's anthology. We have here then a poet who was a documented part of 2 scenes on the West Coast, both the San Francisco Renaissance in Northern California and Venice West in Los Angeles County, who should be entitled to at least a footnote in any full-length literary history of the Beats. Bolletto's The Beats, a literary history, however, allots only 3 pages to the Venice West scene and concentrates only on its best-selling author, Lawrence Lipton, whose study of Venice West as an anarchist utopia for a brief time not so much distracted mainstream culture from North Beach and Greenwich Village, but briefly panicked establishment affiliated media into believing that the beat lifestyle was gaining more of a foothold among young people than was permissible. To the extent that Venice West has its most significant poets stripped out of the narrative, Bolletto's commentary is every bit as much a whitewashing as the well-known Life magazine article, West Coast Beats versus Kansas Squares. If Life and Bolletto only give coverage to Lipton as a beat patriarch, at least Bolletto recognizes the contribution Lipton's The Holy Barbarians made to discourse about the Beats in the late 1950s. Among other aspects, the Beats were known for popularizing poetry readings, not all of which took place at public venues. In Venice West, for instance, Lawrence Lipton turned on his reel-to-reel tape recorder when poets dropped by his house to avail themselves of his well-stocked refrigerator. The University of Southern California not only has the original tapes, but has taken the important step of preserving many of the most important ones through digitization. And I can later on put a link in the chat box, which will enable you to go to these digitized recordings. Boyd's poems are also available on tape in the San Francisco Poetry Archives. 6 months after the reading in San Francisco, which was attended by Jack Spicer, one of Boyd's poems appeared in issue number 6 of the Evergreen Review. And there is a link I can also send you to Emory University's list of all the magazines that Boyd appeared in, which includes Beatitude J, a magazine of poetry, which was Jack Spicer's magazine, The Floating Bear, and Eugen. In addition, Boyd also appeared in the Evergreen Review in the fall of 1958. In the same year that Boyd appeared in Evergreen Review, he signed a 2-page contract with Donald Allen and Grove Press to have permission to have several of his poems appear in an anthology that would sweep many of the poets in the Hall-Pack-Simpson anthology out to the open water of free verse with an overpowering swiftness akin to a cultural riptide. Before we move on, in fact, let us pause and visit the mother lode again. If you look at the cover of New American Poetry, in fact, you can spot Bruce Boyd's name right up in the corner there and the alphabetized list that Allen sets up there. And Boyd, though, is the only one, I repeat, the only one of all the poets in that entire anthology not to even have a chapbook of poems published, not even posthumously. Of course, it should be noted that this was the preference of Venice West poets between 1955 and 1970. Only one of the 3 best poets on that scene had a book out, and that was by Stuart Z. Perkoff from Jonathan Williams' Jargon Press. Now, the most important of Boyd's poems in New American Poetry is Venice Recalled, which I have written about in my book Holdouts. To my surprise, Boyd's poem was also cited and explicated in regards to ideas of community in a recent book on poet and novelist Dennis Cooper, entitled Wrong, also published by Iowa. For the purposes of this brief paper, I will simply reiterate that Boyd compares and contrasts 2 communities of poets, that of the Berkeley and San Francisco Renaissance, and the community he coalesced with in Venice, and that he found the latter to be more congenial in accommodating his own poetics This might come as a surprise to many people, given that San Francisco's scenes and movements are usually perceived as the most buoyant and pervasively giddy about its community's valorization of poetry. Written during one of his sojourns in San Francisco, hence the title, Venice Recalled, this poem in New American poetry surprisingly gives the nod to the Southern scene as being more organically coordinated in its intermingling of the community's environment, domestic life, and the poem as cynosure of a gift exchange economy. Finally, in regard to magazine publication, it is important to share with you a relatively recent discovery I have made, thanks to a friend and fellow scholar, Lawrence Goldstein, who sent me a copy in his own library as just sort of a gift, not even realizing quite how valuable it was, of the first issue of Mendicant magazine, which was edited by beat poet William J. Margolis, who in fact was also the co-founder of Beatitude magazine, along with African-American surrealist poet Bob Kaufman. Now, I'd known of Mendicant, but had never gotten around to reading it when I was working on Holdouts, and it was quite a revelation, for it amounts to a special issue on the Venice West scene. The issue, in fact, should be digitized so that people can see a beat community at both levels of aspiration and accomplishment. Were there mediocre poets in Venice West? Yes. Is there work that establishes why the canon of minor poets is perhaps just as important and in need of contestation as the canon of major poets? Yes. For instance, Boyd's poem, 6-page poem, Flower Pot Sutra, is imprinted in its entirety in Mendicant. Nor was this Boyd's only long poem. Kevin Killian's biography of Jack Spicer, Poet Be Like God, recounts how Boyd gave a reading of a long poem, Toward Morning, which had first appeared in Jack Spicer's magazine, J. In the 11th issue of Adventures in Poetry, a mimeograph magazine edited by New York poet Larry Fagan, a poet long associated with the Poets Project at St. Mark's, as well as Naropa University. That poem got reprinted. In other words, we have here an indication that Boyd's poetry caught the attention of an entirely different scene on the other side of the country at a point when he was no longer publicly active as a poet. I should note that I corresponded with Fagan about this reprinting of Boyd's poem, and he said he had never met Boyd or had any contact with him. He reprinted the poem, he said, simply because he liked it. Now, in the case of Toward Morning, we have a very unusual provenance of materials that it addresses. Spicer, for instance, with whom Boyd was affiliated, was known for not liking drugs, whereas the Beats frequently indulged at every opportunity. The drug ingested at the beginning of Toward Morning, some apotropia instead of an alba, is peyote. Noted in the poem's opening lines, where is the bitter taste I still don't taste, the famous bitter taste, the many little pieces settled in the empty stomach just as easily as pebbles or balls drop from a tower. Quietly, the smartest white horse in your whole heaven is about to refuse to be put through his paces more than one more time. Listen to him stamp his foot in a rhythm of old music, song, soft song, and thinking that in making something mustn't happen is a poverty of satisfaction hard to lift, but above the flow of language is a world that makes it rise. As Plato said, to each a procession of his own, and it wasn't you I think of when I saw the moon or see the sun, but closer where the tide comes, thus children waiting think they can make it rise by moving back. The magic is a law that sees to their advantage in a tide fullness of meaning in their moving, guiding. Plato, the rising and falling, calling, the tide rising, the night falling, the children back to the fire where food is. Marshmallows, yes, they're roasted, and blankets under the stars, spread after the singing, sleep until morning. The entire poem is approximately 6 times longer than the section I have just quoted. And there is little time obviously left today to engage in an explication of text of even this fragment, when the point of the paper is primarily providing context, though I do hope it hasn't escaped your attention how unusual it is to have a poem about peyote conflate itself almost immediately with an image from Plato's Phaedrus. Unless anyone think this poem will inculcate the popular image of beets as non-political, I am now giving you a spoiler alert. If you dig up a copy of this poem, don't be completely caught off guard when toward the end of the poem, Boyd turns his critique on transmogrified figures of political authority, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court, who have added the fascist soundtrack of the Japanese imperial government to their playlist. Their favorite song, that is the Supreme Court justices, is Sina no Yoru, which oddly enough became a sentimental favorite of the American occupation troops, or those serving in the Korean War, She Ain't Got No Yo-Yo. In this portion of Toward Morning, Boyd satirizes the conservative political forces that control American social life and symbolic discourse, which he unfolds into an expedition of the Statue of Liberty to the Vatican in quest of a papal blessing. Even in the presence of such ideological forces complicit with complete social domination, Boyd asserts, quote, "But there's a Buddha that smiles at honest fakes. His angels know that what it means is that the world, those poems we see around us, has got an equal brilliance with our minds, is all, and waits to be born in the bodies of men." The community that could emerge out of a transformative spiritual journey shared with others is one of the outcomes sought by Boyd through the writing of the poem. As in his poem, Venice Recalled, Boyd foregrounds the ability of the poem to inaugurate community in the final brief portion of this poem, Envoy with Angelic Orders. A poem, a group of poems. A poem, a group of poems, a poem about a group of poems, a community of poems, a poem. The first 3 lines of this envoy reenact or enact a progression of sorts, but it is a progression of recuperation. The thought begins with a singular, a poem, and immediately expands to the plural. But in repeating that movement in the second line, a synthesis seems to upwell into the singular again, a poem about a group of poems. So that by the third line, the plural is not simply the happenstance of contiguity, but an actual imbrication of affiliated visions, a community of poems that must be seen as a singular instance within its multiplicity. The poem ends with an imperative. Look here, our Buddha nature wants you to write me a poem again and do what the poem will say. A minor poet, no doubt, a minor poem, no doubt, by a minor poet. But this brings us to the point where the obvious question needs to be asked. Why should Boyd's presence or absence in the canon of contemporary poetry matter? His absence in the canon of major poets is obviously justified. But what about the canon of minor poets? A canon whose formation is long overdue. How else to account for the dozens of fine poets whose work has brought American poetry to this point? Perhaps Boyd's poems will not be granted admission to that volume either, but no such book, no matter how badly needed as a conceptual rubric, can possibly take itself seriously unless every worthy candidate has had an equal chance to have her or his work read. Let me end today, in fact, by pointing out that yet another poet who was part of Venice West and who only recently had her first book of poems published, Eileen Aronson, Ireland, book just came out. She too deserves your attention and our attention, not just as another instance of a woman beat poet. The roll call for nominations is going to take a long time, so we had better settle in for the long 21st century. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. That was great. And now we turn to Wei Liu, who will speak about intimations of the world in Langston Hughes's Montage of a Dream Deferred, dialogic form as global form.
Okay, can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Thank you, First of all, thank you, Steve, for bringing us together and giving me this chance to share some of my preliminary thoughts. And thank you, Lisette and Bill, for the very enlightening and eye-opening talks. So today I'm here just to sort of throw in some of my thoughts here about Hughes's montage of a dream deferred. So let me share my screen. Yeah, okay. Okay. So I'd like to discuss Langston Hughes's montage of a dream deferred, a 1951 poem series about post-World War II Harlem. I'd like to grapple with the divide between local and global, between Hughes as an icon of African-American folk culture and Hughes as a polyglot global traveler. Yet instead of relying on theories of hybridity, translation, and diaspora, I stress the specific international climates of Hughes's times. I'd like to consider how the aesthetic cosmopolitanism of Harlem Renaissance in the 20s, the Popular Front in the 30s, the Anti-Fascist Alliance during World War II, and the McCarthyist hysteria leave their imprints in montage, and what global outlook montage offers both to the Black community and to the mid-century US. As Hughes says in his foreword, montage testifies to a transition. By the way, I don't have time to read all the quotes, so I will just put them on the slides, and I have underlined or circled the points that I want to emphasize. Okay, it was first of all the transition in Harlem's cultural image from the mecca of the Black art to a center of turbulence. Secondly, it was the rise of bebop in the late 40s and early 50s, which replaced the smooth, mellow rhythms of earlier jazz genres with violent beats and disruptive improvisations and challenges traditional ways of hearing. Thirdly, it was the Cold War containment culture and McCarthyism that spread Red Scare and suppressed transgressive ideas and behaviors. In 1953, Hughes was summoned to a McCarthy hearing on the evidence of his earlier pro-communist writings. The 1950s also saw Hughes downplaying his radical commitments. Thus, what's under duress are both Hughes's aesthetic trademark and older form of jazz folk music that had gained international fame and informed his earlier poems during Harlem Renaissance, and his political ideal associated with the proletarian left. I argue that Hughes wants to recuperate both in montage. He seeks to work through the disruptive bebop form to regain the communicative effect of Black art that resulted in jazz's international popularity. And he wants this aesthetic communicability to be a substitute for the proletarian internationalism he couldn't vocalize in Cold War America. Dream Deferred concerns not only racial freedom and equality, but also an international alliance that straddles cosmopolitan aesthetics and global politics. Central to all this is the dialogic form of montage. Obviously, montage has a montage form at once fractured and synthetic, improvisatory and programmatic. By calling this form dialogic, I want to emphasize its communicative affordances that conduce to the poem's worldliness. Dialogic form operates on three levels. One, most individual pieces invite or stage a conversation. Two, many pieces are in dialogue with each other. Either one piece spills over into the next, or different pieces echo each other thematically. Three, many pieces recall information, images, or phrases in Hughes's early writings. The dialogic form has two implications. Spatially, it unsettles boundaries and allows for a spatial mobility in extending Harlem streets into global routes. Temporally, it introduces a historical perspective on the genesis of post-World War II Harlem that correlates global histories of the early 20th century. The dialogic form encourages us to look resonances and parallels which intimate an international dream deferred in the Cold War era. If bebop disrupts and challenges, Hughes by adopting its technique, is working toward communication and recognition. We see this in the very opening piece, Dream Boogie. The dialogue takes the form of one inviting the other to hear things. Listen closely is the instruction of how to approach, to appreciate the poem, and Ain't You Heard is the appeal to mutual recognition. Thus, in the opening, Hughes sets up a goal for his audience to hear the something beneath the poem tries to convey, and is striving toward hearing structures montage as a whole and underpins the poem's global resonances. Using bebop this way, Hughes is trying to recuperate the cosmopolitan aesthetic of jazz. For Hughes, jazz becomes internationally popular because it has a fundamental human appeal. This longing and this laughter combined gives jazz its great basic human appeal and endows it with a kind of universality that causes it to be played and loved around the world. Jazz belongs to everybody now. In this light, montage's emphasis on hearing, communication, and mutual recognition manifests attempt to recover and nourish the roots of Black art's cosmopolitan radiance. I call Hughes's global imagery in, I call Hughes's global imaginary in montage intimations. The world is less a direct object of representation than a contextual impingement. Dialogues do not usher in a concrete world image, but they create a sense of spatial mobility that sustains Harlem's worldly relations. The spatial mobility is discernible on local streets. A conversation may be overheard by someone nearby, and the orbit of the conversation expands to encompass the space occupied by the overhearer. Distinctive instances are comment on the stoop, comment against lamppost, and comment on curb. Critics have shown how these pieces put the speaker's complaint into a broader, more profound context, yet these pieces also broaden space, as each comment adds a stoop, a lamppost, or a curb to the dialogue surroundings. Overheard and spontaneously responded to, once words enter an indefinite, reverberating, and extending space. In other words, to have a conversation, to hear each other, is to experience the enlarging of space. The local street scenarios prelude the references that overtly translocalize Harlem's geography. The migration from the south to the north, as in Theme for English B, the migration from Africa and West Indies to Harlem, as in Brothers and Good Morning, and the soldier's death in Anzio, Italy, as in Freedom Train. With these larger spatial connections, Hughes foregrounds the dialogic form's cosmopolitan potential. The speakers hearing one another in street prepares for the continuous theme of spatial mobility that fuses the local with the global. As suggested by the second piece, Parade, montage offers a chance to let the whole world to see the old Black me. This intimation of the world has its fundamental basis in the dialogic form, whose spatial flexibility recasts the question, spatial flexibility recasts the quest for hearing as a way to regain the cosmopolitan horizon of jazz or Black art. Letting the whole world to see the old Black me also epitomizes Hughes's understanding of Black freedom. For him, the fate of African-American community is inseparable from the oppressed peoples across the world. Such a view stemmed in part from the socio-political conditions of the 1930s, when Harlem suffered under Great Depression and the proletarian revolution gained momentum as a promising alternative. It was also in the 30s that Hughes went to the Soviet Union, both Russia and Central Asia, where he witnessed the liberation of women and peasants from feudalism and in turn berated US racial conditions. For Hughes in the 1930s, the battle against racial discrimination would take effect on the solid ground of the daily working class struggle to wipe out now and forever all the old inequalities of the past. Hughes's communist fervor is continuous with his celebration of the International Brigade and the anti-fascist anti-fascist alliance in World War II. He sees fascism as no different from the KKK. Under the broadest aegis of human liberation, racial divide is transcended and an international alliance emerges for a brand new and democratic world. Montage does not speak directly to international alliance, but it shows a way for discerning its history. If the dialogic form has a corollary of spatial extension that reconstitutes jazz's cosmopolitan scope, does Hughes also transfuse this aesthetic effect with a political vision? In challenging while inviting hearing, does Montage also want us to hear a lingering ring of Hughes's communist anti-fascist articulations? Does spatial extension coincide with the temporal stretch into the recent global history of the Popular Front, a recent past significantly suppressed in Cold War America? To answer these questions, I want to start with the poem Relief, especially the first stanza. Here, Hughes describes the post-war socioeconomic condition that is comparable to the Great Depression. If back then he had hope in the international proletarian movement, here he draws attention to what that movement aimed to redress, a global economic devastation that links poor Harlemites with unemployed Europeans. The last line obliquely recalls the proletarian revolution, for 1933 was the year when Hughes visited Moscow and became fascinated with the revolution. Hence, relief is a pun. It refers both to governmental assistance and a revolutionary absolution from inequality and suffering. Hughes was on relief in 1933 in the second sense because he gained a promising vista of liberation in Soviet Russia. It is a relief from racism as well as from all sorts of economic and social oppression. What relief indexes is Montage's hidden dialogue with Hughes's early experiences and writings of proletarian internationalism. This dialogue is what Hughes challenges the reader to hear as well, particularly with two consecutive pieces, Ladies' Boogie and Freedom Train. Ladies' Boogie reiterates the demand for hearing, and the rhyme here tier overtly defines jazz as conducive to empathy and mutual understanding, an attribute integral to jazz's international popularity. Yet, as the sequence suggests, what Hughes wants us to recognize through such hearing is the freedom train, a recurrent image in his writings in the 30s and 40s. Quote, war's freedom train can hardly trail along with glory behind a Jim Crow coach, end quote, he wrote in the early 40s. He also glorified the train in Soviet Central Asia in the 1930s, seeing it as, quote, the comfortable international car, end quote, as opposed to the segregated train in the US South. These leftist associations are not fully instated in the poem Freedom Train. Freedom Train. Yet the poem enacts a persistent inquiry into what the train is really about. The accentuated monorhyme of N links train with words like plain, explain, and again, suggesting that the train is never a plain image, but has a complex history to be explained so that potentials of liberation will be experienced again. In tune with the here tier in Ladies' Boogie, Freedom Train holds out a particular occasion of hearing for with its rhyme, making us dive into the train's well of meanings that harbors an ideal of proletarian internationalism Hughes couldn't declare in Cold War America. The persistent hearing is both the means of recovering that ideal and a substitute for that ideal. If hearing affects the aesthetic cosmopolitan of jazz that came into prominence during Harlem Renaissance in Montage, this cosmopolitanism becomes a shadow image of the proletarian internationalism. Hughes broaches the correlation by repeating a titular phrase, good morning. He has written but 3 poems with this phrase in the title, Good Morning Revolution in 1934, which sings for the International Proletarian Revolution, Good Morning Stalingrad in 1942, which applauds the Soviet Union's defeat of the Nazis, and Good Morning in Montage, which recounts a Black migration during Harlem Renaissance. In transposing the title phrase from the pro-communist poems to the montage piece, Hughes implicitly links the proletarian revolution to the global history of Harlem Renaissance, suggesting the possibility of retaining suggesting the possibility of retaining the political internationalism of the Popular Front via an aesthetically oriented internationalism, which is the Black cosmopolitanism of the jazz age that champions and is sustained by hearing. Indeed, the refrain, "You ain't dead" in Good Morning's Stalingrad has the same vernacular ring as in Ain't You Heard in Good Morning, as if the spirit of the international left is not dead once it is being heard. In the global context, montage's dialogic form attests to the aesthetic of hearing preserves the afterlife of Hughes's political ideal. In sum, with its dialogic form reaching beyond local space and time, montage exhibits Hughes's effort to articulate a revolutionary internationalism ruled out by containment. To take up and work through the bebop challenge of hearing, Ain't You Heard, is to call on mid-century America to revisit a recent global history. It is also to aesthetically retain a political ideal to valorize jazz's cosmopolitan radiance in place of and in recognition of the ethos of the international left. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Thank you very much. Really interesting talk. And now we will hear from Bill Fogerty, Resisting Ruin, the Persistence of Sound in Sylvia Plath and Gwendolyn Brooks. So we've moved from west to east as this program has continued. Bill?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for including me in this great panel. As Steve said, my paper is called Resisting Ruin, the Persistence of Sound in Sylvia Plath and Gwendolyn Brooks. Roman Jakobson long ago assigned to poetry the eminence of sound. It may seem odd to present sound as an inherent value, but this is precisely what Jakobson did when he distinguished poetry from other literary genres. For he recognized that while poetry is not the only area where sound symbolism makes itself felt, it is the province where the internal nexus between sound and meaning changes from latent into patent and manifests itself most palpably and intensely. Nevertheless, Craig Dworkin and Marjorie Perloff's observation over a decade ago still holds true, even though they argued in 2011, the sound dimension is central to any and all poetry. No other poetic feature is currently as neglected. A few recent studies have attended to this lapse. For example, Andrew Reed's Soundworks, published in 2020, argues that sound is a radical, essential component of Black arts poetry, operating in tandem with a host of sound-producing cultural practices, from poems themselves to their engagements with other genres. Peter Robinson's 2018 The Sound Sense of Poetry claims that poetry unifies what is thought to be the separate categories of sound as pure sound and sound as meaning, and in that unification enlists verbal experiences from the social world. The sound of a poem's sense, Reed claims, can ring true or not, just like real-world utterances. This paper follows along the lines of Reed's and Robinson's work in that it also maintains that sound communicates meaning in poetry that is social because semantics itself is sonic and social. Whereas Reed, Dworkin, and Perloff focus on poetry that makes sound from avant-garde style pyrotechnics with roots in music, the experiments of early 20th century modernism, and revolutionary social protest, I listen to the more conventional sound effects of poetry produced by repeated vowels and consonants. And I do so not in the overtly experimental realm of, say, the language poets or sound poetry, but in two canonical poems that are among the most famous of the mid-20th century, Sylvia Plath's Ariel and Gwendolyn Brooks's We Real Cool. These may seem an unlikely pairing, one representatively confessional and one explicitly alert to the social world, as well as an unlikely pair for an argument that subordinates poetic speaker to sound. For both emphasize the first person, Plath's in the singular, Brooks in the plural. They also each evoke self-destruction, while their poetic sound effects enact resistance to the ruin they anticipate, orchestrating sound as much as pronoun while struggling with imminent threat. Plath's Ariel is, as scores of readers have observed, a poem of renewal and of union in its portrayal of a woman and her horse metamorphosing during a vigorous, transcendent ride at dawn into a new, powerful being. As recently as 2020, Heather Clark, in her formidable biography of Plath, points up the poem's exuberance as it portrays an early morning gallop over the moors and echoes the pure, unadulterated joy Sylvia experienced coasting down the snowy hills of Wellesley. The joy Plath found riding in life may have been unadulterated, but joy in the poem, like all its circulating sensibilities, is not. For the transformed Pegasus-like figure at the end runs suicidal toward a sun imagined as a scorching red crucible. The poem is all opposition, at once spirited and deadly, controlled and unrestrained, unhurried and brisk. Do the poem's stark enjambments, for example, accelerate or decelerate its rhythm? They do both, and not intermittently, but all at once. Indeed, the poem's essential aspect is neither the fall into death, nor a renewal achieved before it or through it. Rather, the poem is its own orchestration of resistance, rehearsing through an interplay of consonance and assonance, an energetic, conflicting will, confronting destructive urges in an exhilarating yet pernicious environment. The echoes of Ariel resound at the outset in an entirely abstracted sphere where sound is promoted over physical setting. The opening stanza presents an aural field rather than a visual stage. Stasis in darkness, then the substanceless blue pour of tour and distances. This is not a setting, but a setting up of stillness, obscurity, opacity, color, activity, material, and space. And it is created by attunement, consonantal sibilants producing rhythm, but uneasily. The accumulating S sounds generated by a series of 2- and 3-syllable words that also contain E and A sounds, stasis, darkness, substanceless, distances. The multiple S, E, and A sounds and the polysyllabic words lend an almost tortuous pronounceability to the poem, a stark cumbersomeness marked by its contrast to the stanza's most enigmatic phrase, pour of tour. That repeated or sound struck against the S, E, and A notes and the hard T of tour, linking back to stasis and substanceless and ahead to distances. In other words, the poem produces soundscape before it produces landscape, prioritizing the acoustics of its lexical environment over the concrete horse riding scene the poem proceeds to assemble. The landscape, horse, and woman come into view not by description, but by the sound of direct address in the next stanza that introduces the poem's first-person speaker and the correlating and accruing long I sound. The woman apostrophizes the horse, addressing it as God's lioness, the first of the poem's increasingly insistent I sounds, joining the animal and her not just in the semantic meaning of what she tells the horse, how one we grow, but in the W sounds connecting each one-syllable word. The line is both a single continuous sound and 4 discrete staccato notes. This gives way, indeed pivots, to the end rhyme of grow and furrow, the long E of heels and knees, more sibilants in the repetition of S sounds, the short I of splits and sister, and a series of N sounds in brown, neck, and cannot that lands on the poem's jarring employment of the most degrading word a white person can utter in the English language. That the word forms a sonic chain with brown and neck only augments its expression of brutality. All this occurs in the service of the I sound, insisting upon its dominance. The poem's shocking instance of racism has been notoriously overlooked, but Cameron Javadizadeh has recently elucidated that it is precisely such racism that was commonplace in mid-century confessional poetry, which often posited its construction of whiteness as a universality that senses its own sovereignty to be under threat by any number of forces explicitly or implicitly related to social hierarchies. We can hear something of this in the Sounds of Ariel, for its exploitative racist language establishes the long I sound as the poem's supreme sound, affixing I to the derogation to make a strange, halting, noxious compound construction that jolts as it merges speaker, not just with their horse, but with the social world that denigrates brown and black people, one where Plath sheds dead hands and dead stringencies, but where she also reveals her own capacity for oppressiveness. In other words, her reliance on racism in the poem demonstrates her inextricability from the most atrocious aspects of the world she seeks to flee. The white confessional poet could use racism to its advantage, and the language of racism here injects the poem's I sound with excess and shock, a bolt, if you will, out of the blue. The writer doesn't know what hauls her through air, calling it only something else, but she does know she is becoming the I she emphasized with such toxicity. As the poem moves toward its finish, she addresses this new composite of woman and horse in terms she has already presented as racial. White Godiva, I unpeel, she says, then I foam to wheat, while her child's cry melts in the wall. The I sounds continue to proliferate in a verbal plane predicated on that sound. The pronoun presented 4 times in the poem, the I as vision twice, and the sound thickening across the poem from lioness, white, Godiva, and cry, to flies, suicidal, drive, and finally I, that last instance looking back to its earlier disparaging manifestation. However, the end is not an equivocal assertion of the dominant self, for the poem closes with the image of the sun as a dangerous cauldron and the slant rhyme of that word with mourning. The I sound is desperately trying to assert itself in a linguistic realm that would devour it and anything else vulnerable in its range. Published a few years before Plath's Ariel, Gwendolyn Brooks's We Real Cool epitomizes in its rhetorical movements how poetry can employ sound, not just for, say, the private expression typically associated with lyric, but to advance a criticism of society. The poem is a phrasal portrait of Black boyhood in America's cities, where prospects are dim and temptations high to skirt the institutions of a social structure that operates on oppression. Its elaborate diction, arranged into an exceptionally stringent structure, animates youthful vivacity and determination against the intersecting forces of racism and classism. It summarizes the lives of 7 adolescents in 4 monosyllabic couplets that transform colloquial language into a series of coinciding sounds. The mechanistic pattern of those sounds in those scrupulously ordered and consistent couplets convey brio and liveliness, even as the poem's speakers march toward early death. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. The poem foregrounds the fact that it is a dramatic monologue. Its subtitle, The Pool Players, 7 at the Golden Shovel, announce its speakers and its line endings create a column of the first person plural pronoun we, perhaps 7 in a row for each player. And yet, while We Real Cool is grounded in Black speech, a script for 7 young Black characters set in a Chicago pool hall, speaking either in unison or in sequence, it brings equal attention to the reverberating phrases it gathers into its form. For even as the poem begins in the colloquial language of Black vernacular, we real cool, we left school, It gives way immediately to a series of assertions that aren't exactly colloquial, but designed to convey sonically something of the essence of young Black boys talking in the pool hall. We lurk late, strike straight, sing sin, thin gin, jazz June. The language is too uniform to be exactly everyday speech. Rather than realistic idioms, the expressions are Brooks's inventions, carefully calibrated to elicit via sound the energy of teenagers. The poem mobilizes at least two speech registers at once. A musical, figurative, even obscure language emerges from an unambiguous idiomatic voice before settling back into the bluntly plain-spoken, "We die soon." The oral effects are rhythmic and lilting in the way one might imagine the teen speech to be. The web of sound effects exceptionally intricate. They include the repetition of "we" and an interlaced arrangement of internal exact rhyme, alliteration, and consonance. The poem is, in other words, an aggregate of connecting notes. In fact, all but one of the poem's 24 words affix to other words in the poem through sound. Die doesn't relate to any other words by way of rhyme, alliteration, or consonance. And while all the other verbs in the poem are linked to their modifiers by sound, die doesn't associate formally with soon. The highly ornate and enigmatic poetic language Brooks has devised enacts the brio of youth and the jolt of such vitality abruptly cut off. The poem's language is at once certain, natural, and lyrical, but it also surmises that the boys' striking, singing, drinking, and jazzing may be fatal. The pool players are demonstrative, determined, even recalcitrant, and yet their teenage exuberance is countered by an acute awareness of a perilous fate. Indeed, the 7 line endings of "we" march down the page finally to blank space in that last line. The tragedy of the poem is that adolescent experience for these Black children includes all the liveliness we might expect from young people, and it conveys that liveliness in a verbal gusto that is quickly halted by a blunt statement of impending doom. Brooks herself was insistent about the poem's political import, singling out the catchy but finally elusive phrase "Jazz June" as a lexical rejoinder to threatening socio-political forces. She says, "I use the month of June as an establishment symbol, whereas the rest of us love and respect June and wait for it to come so we can enjoy it. They jazz June, derange in it and scratch it and do anything that would annoy the establishment." We Real Cool came to demonstrate for Brooks the capacity of sound to assert individuality against the social forces that would eradicate it. Her poem, and Platt's poem in a very different way, wield sound to derange and annoy their own establishments and the establishments that gave rise to them. The entry on sound in the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics explains that since Plato, the debate about sound and poetry has asked, does sound have meaning? The answer, the entry states, is no, but with numerous qualifications. One qualification, according to the Princeton, is that sound patterns like assonance and consonance can function to tag words of special importance. In poems like Ariel and We Real Cool, we find that sound needs no qualification, that it doesn't only operate as a tag, that it can be its own importance, and in some cases is the importance. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank all 4 of our excellent speakers today. I'm going to open the floor now to discussion and questions. Would anyone like to discuss? Bill.
I wanted to ask Wei. Wei, thanks very much thanks for all those papers. They're really just wonderful. And Wei, I really liked your paper. I love Langston Hughes's work, and I really love what you're doing with it, and how you're examining Hughes's connection to and intense interest in Eastern European politics. And I'm really interested in speech and the way poets like you transform different versions of speech and everyday communication and different versions of colloquial language. And I was wondering if if you could say a little bit about Hughes's connection between, or what the connection is, or is there a connection between employing Black vernacular when he is apostrophizing and talking directly to, Russia as an entity, or Eastern politics, apostrophizing Eastern politics.
Yeah. Thank you, Bill, for your comments and the question. Yeah, I think to sort of, I guess I will just sort of think out loud a little bit about this Eastern politics and how Hughes sort of responds to that. So what I was trying to do in my little talk is to think about how Hughes is sort of recuperating his commitment to the sort of communist ideal, under the threat of the Cold War and McCarthyism, etc. And I guess the connection is on the level of the aesthetic. It's not something that can be it's not something that can be sort of explicitly said during his time, but he could figure out a sort of artistic pattern to sort of give a sort of vicarious a representation of his political ideal. And as to the Black vernacular, it's something that he is part of his trademark. And also, I guess one thing to sort of add to the connection is that he actually was very fascinated with the idea of Pushkin having an African blood in him. And in the 30s, when you read his essays, he was saying, well, in Russia, we actually have this literary predecessor, who was an African who was partly an African, but who has already gained the global fame as a literary figure. Hence, we African Americans somehow can sort of reach the same level, and the source to sort of reach that level, I guess, is partly through folk culture, through the jazz and vernacular culture. So I guess there are a lot more connections to be mapped out, and I'm here just focusing on one poem, to sort of give some very sort of surface talks here, but there are a lot more sort of in-depth and so wide and a lot more sort of profound connections between Hughes's understanding of Black experience and his global vision in terms of both East European culture and probably also South America and China and all on other places. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I have answered your question, but thank you so much for your question.
Yeah, no, you absolutely have, and I really like how you are making a connection between sort of raising something, for lack of a better term, to the level of aesthetic and employing Black vernacular in order to do exactly that. So I think that's a really powerful thing to observe.
Thank you so much.
Other comments or questions?
Actually, Steve, I have several, but I'd like to hear from some other people too. But I mean,
why don't you pose one of yours and then I'll pose one to you, actually.
Lizette?
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah, I was really interested in your talk and I've admired Cervantes's work for a long time. I'd point out, she hasn't been anthologized anywhere near as much as she really deserves to be. So I'm glad you're working on her. It's the anthologies, right, where the real action takes place, and she certainly deserves to be in it. But along the lines that I was thinking of like minor poets, I'm wondering if you've looked at poets like Manazar Gamboa or Victor Valle or the Taco Shop poets. I'm wondering if, I've done some work on Southern California poets. So why don't I send you I'll send you some names down the line, because I think you'd, especially if you're Palomar's in San Diego, right? Yeah, so you're based right here at a really great spot for that. And there's a lot of amazing work waiting to be done. I know they're relatively minor, quote, minor poets, whereas I think Cervantes could be argued is a major poet. And I was great to hear your talk. I was wondering, if asking you a question, is there how would we define the liminal space between trauma and grief? You mentioned in particular that there's sort of trauma and then there's grief, which I see aligned with mourning, but is there any in-between space that is particularly difficult in terms of the mother-daughter relationship to negotiate?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. Because I think maybe they can get conflated, right? Or kind of just get, but I think at least, is a really good question. Leave it to another English professor to really take it there.
Well, if you want, I could make a point to, you can think about it, because I have a book I wanted to mention to Bill Fogerty, for instance, and we can come back if you want.
No, I mean, I think it's and I'm just trying to think of how to verbalize it. I think that the grief, I think about like the trauma as like the punctum that happens over and over again, right? And then the grief is what lives there. It's a consistent, sometimes it gets submerged, and I think grief can be more insidious. Not that trauma can't be, but I guess in terms of like affect, being an affect, grief can, it can sneak up on you, but in a different way than trauma. I think maybe that's one way. That's my initial answer, but I definitely would want to think about that more. And I would love to hear your recommendation.
I think you just hit upon something there. That sneakiness, that grief sneaks. That's the liminal space. It's the sneaking part, the sneaking up part, which precisely perhaps is what creates that liminal space. Just when you think you're free or safe, right? That's when it pounces, and therefore it's the very sneakiness of grief is what it is.
As I say, but Boulez has a poem about that, about the loss. I can't remember the name of the sonnet that that's in, but it also makes me think of Freud's of Mourning and Melancholy, where he ends it. I think that's what makes melancholy so dangerous, is that it's there, it won't go away, and then it turns on you. And
yeah. For Bill Fogerty, I wanted to mention that book that for me, what was a classic book. Steve, you probably remember it. Harvey Gross's Sound and Form in Modern Poetry, which was so good that it was reprinted in 1996, which is pretty rare for an academic book. And I think that might be a really interesting book for you to take and work on this issue of sound. I was completely as somebody who still loves, who retains, despite my affiliation with beat poets, loves meter and metrical verse. I was really drawn to your paper very much.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thanks for that recommendation. I've come across the title. I have not read it, and I will certainly look at that. I find like there's a lot. There are a lot of studies with the words sound and poetry in the titles, and then there is not always the kind of analysis of sound that proves to be helpful in terms of close reading poems. So thank you for this. I will take a look at that, definitely.
Bill, I wanted to ask you, I thought that it was really a great analysis. It really opened my eyes to both poems, and particularly to Gwendolyn Brooks poem. I've never before really liked that poem, and suddenly I do. I think, you know, you did the perfect job of showing the artistry really and the power of that poem. But one thing I wanted to ask about the Plath one is that you associated all the A letters together. But in fact, if we're talking about sound, the A sounds differently in stasis from the way it sounds in darkness. So, you know, I thought, oh, well, we've momentarily moved to the visual rather than to the sonic. What's your comment about that? Or is the sonic and the visual, is that really a binary that that, you know, is kind of interpermeable or something like that?
I do think it's interpermeable. I know exactly what you're talking about in that specific instance. And I know when I first wrote the first version of this paper, I had indicated the long A sound and the short A sound and the E sound. And I thought it was kind of muddling the issue to be so sort of discreet about those different sounds. And when what I wanted to communicate, and perhaps I need to do this better, is that there is a distinction between that sort of hissing sibilance, that consonantal sound, and the kind of airiness of those vowels, you know, in that E and in that short A and long A sound, and then starkly contrasted to those hard consonants of pour, of tour. Mm-hmm. So it's, you know, it's one of the difficulties when you're talking about sound, because, you know, how specific do you get, and you know, how much do you break it into individual units, or can you approach it a little bit more organically and you know, sort of talk about the overall effect of it. So like when I got to that part about, you know, in Plath's poem, where it's such a brilliant line when she says, "How one we grow." I do think it's sonic. I do think it sounds like one continual sound. I do think it sounds like how one we grow, a staccato set of notes. And also when you look at the line visually, the W in every word, not every word because it's not in one, but the W really does kind of make a little bit of a visual connection there too. So I do think it's interchangeable. And I probably have to figure out a way to better talk about sound sort of holistically, but also indicate what the very specific individual units are too.
Yeah, maybe explain a little better at the outset the point you're trying to make, and then
sure.
Then we would get that. But that one we grow, you know, part of the power is the way that the W shifts spot from being the first sound in the first two, one we, to the last sound in grow. It's almost like a Gertrude Stein kind of sound play.
Sure.
Great.
I wanted to say something about Wei Liu's very interesting paper, because I was struck by yesterday, I think yesterday, the panel on, there was a paper on female poet, and Eve Merriam was mentioned as a female poet of her time. And I feel like poets like Eve Merriam or wheelwrights, poets of the time who have a very sort of Marxist or socialist output, like very political, but specifically sort of very far left-wing political, have sort of dropped out of circulation. And Langston has sort of persisted, and it's very interesting. And I feel like he's not usually read along the lines that you read him in, which I find super interesting. Do you feel like, do you have more like the other writers of the tradition who wrote in that sentence who are not as read anymore? Again, Wheelwright, I think, is out of print. Eve Merriam is largely out of print. Do you know why he, despite being clearly strongly left-wing, in as you showed, why he survived so well?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Marcel, for this question. Well, this is actually something that I have been reading about these days, because I'm not an African American expert. I'm just, you know, I did like this paper is just my sort of starting point to sort of enter into African American poetry, and yes, I think you point out a very important question in the various in the narrative about African American literature that is this kind of suppression of the writer's leftist commitment. So in fact, almost all the African American writers in the mid-century have some kind of involvement with communism, with the left. For instance, Robert Hayden started out with very sort of leftist poems, but later on he sort of refashioned his career, into this more sort of meditative, aesthetic version of himself. And also, in fact, Gwendolyn Brooks have some kind of involvement too, but it's not sort of it's not in direct terms, but somehow probably you can do a comparison there. Well, I'm not an expert, but that probably Bill, you can inform us about that. And also I think Hughes, for like the reason why Hughes why his work is still sort of circulating, I think it has a lot to do with his own self-consciousness during the mid-century. Like what I try to present here is a kind of underlying narrative. It's not on the surface, but he somehow tries to preserve his older sort of political ideal, in this kind of esoteric kind of writing. And in fact, Hughes, well, in fact, his late work, especially like montage and the things that he produced around that time, were not very well sold. They were sold very badly, and it has something to do with his past involvement with the Communist Party and the Popular Front. But at the same time, he himself was very conscious of this problem, and he tried to sort of realign himself with the more conservative side of the civil rights movement. Yeah, so these are the sort of preliminary answers that I have for you. But thank you so much for your question.
Yeah, but Wei, it is the case that Montage of a Dream Deferred is a long poem, and it is a single poem, is out of print. It's been out of print for decades. You can get a copy of The Wasteland as a standalone book. You can get a copy of Crane's The Bridge as a standalone book. You can get a copy of The Dream Songs as a standalone book, but you can't get Montage of a Dream Deferred as a standalone book.
Oh, okay.
It's really, that's something that has aggravated me for quite some time now. That when I try to teach it, I kind of have to bootleg it from a book, because you can't just assign, here's the ISBN number, go and get the book. I've never been able to figure out why the book is not available as that. In fact, it should be the subject of a Norton Critical Edition. That's and so to me, that's really where that's the scary part about Hughes. Yes, he's still present, but nobody else suffers that indignity of having their major long poem out of print. I mean, it's that's something needs to be done in that regard.
Yeah.
Maybe the presence of left politics in it is, as opposed to the politics in the Wasteland, is working against it still. So,
yes.
I want to point out that we're past the 3:50, so if you need to be somewhere else, you have my blessings and our blessings to depart. But if we want to stay for a little bit more and ask other questions or say other things, let's do it.
Yes, Bill, I want those links to those recordings that you mentioned.
Here, I'll dig them. We won't sign off until I can put them in there. I just sent Ashley a comment to Bill Fogerty. There are 7 at the Golden Shovel, but there are 8 sentences. And I view each we as spoken by one of the 7, and the final we spoken by all of them. In other words, I noticed there were 8 we's, but there's 7. So it's like each one is kind of bragging, we, speaking for the group, we thin gin, we do this. And so each one is going around kind of holding the pool cue and kind of, bragging about it. And then as a kind of unified chorus, we die soon, which would actually play, Bill, I love that thing you pointed about the sound difference where die and soon. It's like, even as they say the words together, there's this awful sinking feeling, like at the end of Lear, we that are young shall never see so much nor live so long. Gulp. I mean, that means that we aren't gonna live as long as Lear did. The end is near for us, sooner than we want to think, so that we die soon. But the way that you pointed out that sound device, I think, is like kind of gorgeous in a way.
I really like your reading of that too, and I think one of the interesting things, one of the many interesting things about the poem is because it's so consistent and it's so sort of, rhetorically exact in its structure. You can imagine it being read any number of ways, precisely because of that. And I do think that there is a similarity in the linguistic register in the last line and the first line. I think there's a sort of colloquiality that frames the poem. Brooks is constantly referred to as a Black vernacular poet, and she is emphatically often the very opposite of a colloquial poet. But she's often suggesting speech and suggesting Black speech specifically, and then presenting contexts where no one is actually speaking in any kind of language that anyone would actually use in a day-to-day context. And I think what's so brilliant about We Real Cool is she's able to do that in her, 8 little lines or however long it is.
And three word sentences.
Yeah.
That poem has gone from from one of her lesser poems to one of her masterpieces in the course of this hour. So I want to thank you for that. I also wanted to raise the question of minor, maybe start with Bill. It made me think of Deleuze and Guattari in the Kafka book and towards a minor literature, and minor there means, I think, different in some way in terms of ethnicity or maybe also gender, and being resistant to it's more like being, isn't it?
Well, I think Deleuze and Guattari, I think, are largely referring to those literatures that come from the former colonial, where other languages and there's a conflict between the hegemonic language imposed by the imperialist power and the more and the language that's indigenous to the people living there, and how those languages belong to a quote minor literature because they aren't widely spoken on a global level. So it's about power relationships there, right? Although I think that notion of a minor literature has been somewhat, and it appeals to me because it has a certain way that it can blend with the notion of regional resistance to the hegemony of areas that have more of a legacy of cultural capital, shall we say. In particular, that I'm an advocate for West Coast poetry against the sort of presumptions of the East Coast publishing establishment. That's largely, I do think that there is a kind of maybe need to think about the notion of a minor poet. I think so many poets, speaking as one myself, are made to feel that if you aren't major, well, you wasted your life, whereas there's a great deal of dignity, I think, what's being, if you will, a minor poet. That's a real accomplishment. And that maybe in just in terms of the psychic health of the creative imagination in our society in general, that people, artists in general, ought to be more compassionate towards themselves and being very pleased with just if you can be a minor artist or a minor poet. or a minor critic, you know. I mean, if I could achieve that, I would have achieved something, you know what I mean? I think it's a lot more healthy. By the way, could I speak, could I say something to Wei? I noticed that when he was talking about the Freedom Train, I thought, oh, I think the parade that gets mentioned very early on montage in a certain way is like that. It's like a foreshadowing of the Freedom Train, because a train has all these cars. It is kind of a parade of, you know, of transit. There's a lot of people on it. There's a sense of a mass movement to a train. And there really was, of course, a real Freedom Train. It wasn't just a symbol on Hughes's part. There was literally under Truman, a Freedom Train that went around the country. I think it carried the Constitution with it. It was an actual sort of event.
Oh, okay. Thank you for this information. That's really fascinating, and I like your reading a lot about how, you know, parade is foreshadowing a Freedom Train. How like both poems are about mass movements, and you know, it's a movement that it's not just sort of located in Harlem, but somehow stretches beyond Harlem, right? In parade, we saw this this claim about, you know, letting the whole world see old black me, and in Freedom Train there is this direct reference to the to World War II and to the black and white soldiers, etc. And also, I think sort of adding to this kind of foreshadowing narrative is that in parade you see the sort of the kind of opposition between white and black. You know, white policemen are sort of you know, surveilling the protesters, but when it comes to Freedom Train, it's more of an articulation of the ideal, like the black and white soldiers can sort of share a bond in this kind of anti-fascist alliance. Exactly.
That's terrific, Wei. I've taught this poem many times. I never thought of that. You're right. You're absolutely right there with that black and white contrast and the parade and then the Freedom Train. Please explore that. That's
okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, anyone else have something that they need to say or would like to say?
Yeah, Steve, why didn't you give a paper at this time? I always look forward to your papers.
Oh, well, next time I will, but honestly, just organizing and sharing.
Well, I bet.
And most of all, dealing with the new technology of, what is it called, Hoover? Which I'm always like a late adopter and adapter, and then when I have a lot of trouble with it, you know, and that is like all consuming. So
yeah, well, I just wanted you to know that your contribution was missed, not least by me.
Well, thank you.
I always look forward to your papers. They're
awfully kind, and yes, I will. I will.
Oh, you'll get one at UCLA then?
Yeah. Okay, I will.
All right. Provided it's live.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, who knows what the future is? Do we have a return of the in-person, or is this? I imagine we will, as COVID becomes. There are more, you know, therapies for it, but obviously it's too late for it to go away now. So we've lost that battle. So anyway, we'll see what the future
well,
brings.
It was great to meet all of you. Thanks to everyone who was here today.
Yeah, I want to agree with that, and do wonderful papers and wonderful discussions. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, it's really a great pleasure
See you at
to
UCLA.
talk to everybody. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Steve.
Oh, great, Bill.
I know how to organize this must have just been like, you know.
Yeah, you know, I canceled my class for tomorrow because I'm wiped out.
That's what I'm thinking. I've still got to get right. I've got all these emails from students to answer, right? And
yeah, well, you know, I thought the thought of like preparing what I'd have to do for tomorrow just seemed like a straw that would break my camel's back. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it'll be fine.
Well, so, oh, I wanted to ask you, I haven't forgotten, I still got 2 footnotes to get to you. How soon what's the volume that Stephen, that Craig and you are editing?